I do not intend to continue my mission when my mandate expires at the end of August.
Kofi Annan resigns from his position as peace envoy for Syria. Where does this leave efforts at international mediation? And what's the US role in all of this? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. While it was no secret that Kofi Annan was frustrated at his failure to implement a six-point peace plan in Syria, we're told his announcement on Thursday took the international community by surprise. Clearly, the prospects for a negotiated end to the violence look grim. Annan blamed his decision on what he described as Syrian government intransigence and the escalating military campaign of the opposition. But he was particularly critical of what he called the failure of a divided international community. In another development, it's emerged that President Barack Obama has secretly authorized US support for the Free Syrian Army. That's according to reports from the Reuters news agency, which cite US sources. This is thought to include clandestine CIA backup. But the White House is maintaining its public position that arming the rebels is not a solution. The uprising against President Bashar al-Assad began 17 months ago. It's now escalated into civil war. Here's what Kofi Annan had to say as he resigned in Geneva.
At a time when the Syrian people desperately need action, there continues to be finger-pointing and name-calling in the Security Council. The Geneva Communique, endorsed by the Action Group for Syria on 30 June, provided an international agreement on a framework for political transition. This should have been automatically endorsed by the Security Council and something the international community should have built on.
So what does Kofi Annan's resignation tell us about the international community's approach towards Syria? Joining me to discuss this is Flynt Leverett, Professor of International Relations at Penn State University, a former White House official under George W. Bush. He's written extensively on Syria and has met Bashar al-Assad several times. In New York, Carne Ross, he was a British diplomat at the United Nations Security Council until he resigned over the Iraq War. He founded Independent Diplomat, an independent diplomatic advisory group. And Michele Dunne, she was on the White House National Security Council and a former diplomat. She is now director at the Atlantic Council's Rafiq Hariri Center for the Middle East. I thought we might begin actually with an op-ed that Kofi Annan has written, or at least published subsequent to his resignation in the Financial Times, which sheds some more light on his reasons for quitting. Here's a portion. A political process is difficult, if not impossible, while all sides, within and without Syria, see opportunity to advance their narrow agendas by military means. International division means support for proxy agendas and the fueling of violent competition on the ground. Michele Dunne, this is the problem. What we're seeing at the United Nations has nothing to do either with the democratic aspirations of the Syrian people or with conflict resolution for that matter. It's simply this proxy war, this hegemonic struggle for power, and that's the problem.
Well, I can't say I agree with that, Shihab. I mean, first of all, we have to remember that it's not as though outsiders started this in Syria, right? This started as a popular uprising in Syria, a peaceful popular uprising. And the Syrian government used a great deal of force against peaceful demonstrations, and it has indeed degenerated now into an armed rebellion. So now, I mean, it is certainly true that the outside parties, whether it is the United States, Russia, the Gulf Arabs, et cetera, they all bring their own interests to the table when it comes to formulating their approach to what is essentially an internal Syrian conflict. But I mean, that doesn't mean that it started out that way. And unfortunately, it's the fact that it's gone on all this time unresolved that of course opens the country to more and more external influence.
But Carne Ross, there's this question of whether the reason why it remains unresolved is because peace was never actually given a chance. Also in that FT op-ed, Kofi Annan says in passing, after a ceasefire on April the 12th, contrary to some claims, the government's shelling of civilian communities stopped, demonstrating the impact this unity could have. Sustained international support did not follow. The problem, Carne Ross, was a successful ceasefire wasn't part of the narrative. This was about once the ball was rolling, this was about regime change in Syria.
Well, it's a slightly odd way of describing what is a fairly straightforward problem and why there has been no peace and why his mission has failed. The first reason, as far as I can see, is very clear, which is neither side, if one can characterise them as that in Syria, wanted peace. There was no deal available. Neither side indicated they wanted mediation, and yet a mediator was sent. The second reason, I think it is fair for Annan to say that international disunity has undermined his mission. The Security Council has been unable to agree clear measures dealing with the Syrian issue, in particular clear measures against the regime, for instance, a military embargo, astonishing really in the circumstances. And that, I think, has given succour to the Assad regime. I think the Russian and Chinese vetoes on stern action from the Security Council has encouraged the Assad regime not to deal with the opposition, not to confront the reality of transition. So we're in a pretty disastrous situation now.
But let me return to the question. Perhaps I didn't explain it terribly well. There was a narrative at the outset. Actually, there's a sentence from Reuters I saw on One Wire, which could easily have been cut and pasted at any point over the preceding weeks. World powers have watched with mounting concern as diplomatic efforts to find a negotiated solution have faltered and violence worsened. Flynt Leverett, one wonders whether that was the narrative at the outset, perhaps unwittingly for members of the media. Kofi Annan points out there were these moments where there were openings for negotiated settlements, perhaps even suggestions of having a contact group involving all interested actors. But there was never any serious belief in that, perhaps because people didn't necessarily want to believe that that was possible. A negotiated settlement was a way out.
Well, I think that Mr. Annan's effort was undermined by two things. It was undermined primarily not by Russia and China, but by the United States. It was the United States which kept Mr. Annan from doing his job as a diplomat. Annan and his staff realized from the beginning of their mission that you needed a serious contact group involving all of the relevant regional and international players. By definition, that meant that Iran would have to be included. The Obama administration refused to countenance this, and this definitely undermined Annan on several important levels. Annan also, to some degree, undermined himself, because while he says, I think, the right things about the need for an inclusive process that involves all of the relevant parties, not just at the regional and international level, but all of the relevant parties in Syria too, he also bought into the argument that you should stipulate at the outset that President Assad needed to go. And that, by definition, also meant that there couldn't really be a serious political process. The Obama administration also undermined him, I think, as some of your reporting was alluding, because the United States is now working with other countries basically to arm one side in a civil war.
But in his op-ed again for the Financial Times...
Also is Russia.
Well, we'll get to Russia in a second. In Kofi Annan's op-ed there in the FT, he is a bit more nuanced there. He actually blames the obsession with Assad as a reason, perhaps, for his failure. Although, typically with Kofi Annan, you have to sort of, perhaps, you read a little bit between the lines. But anyway, this is another portion. This also means recognizing that the future of Syria rises and falls on more than the fate of just one man. It's clear that President Bashar al-Assad must leave office. The greater focus, however, must be on measures and structures to secure a peaceful long-term transition to avoid a chaotic collapse. This is the most serious issue. The international community must shoulder its share of responsibility. Again, the rhetoric, the narrative, Assad is a bad man. This is all about Assad. He must step down before peace negotiations perhaps can even begin. This is the sort of thing we would hear from Susan Rice and Hillary Clinton. It's that sort of narrative that leads to an utter failure of attempts at conflict resolution, surely. Michele.
Well, look, I think that Carne Ross was right in saying that, in essence, nobody asked for a mediator here, a mediator between the Syrian rebels and Bashar al-Assad, in the sense that they would somehow reach an agreement.
Nobody asked, but theoretically, a negotiated settlement surely is Isn't that what the UN's for?
Right,
Sorry,
but the problem is that, of course, this is a rebellion against the rule of Bashar al-Assad, and if basically you've still got him in control of a regime that's not going to reach any settlement that involves him leaving.
Before negotiations have taken place?
Well, it's not that we've made that decision, but that's the nature of the rebellion. The nature of a rebellion is that they want a change in the regime. Now, that doesn't mean that absolutely everyone who's ever been involved in the Syrian government has to leave. But if it doesn't involve a change in the top leadership, then I don't think you're going to get anyone on the Syrian opposition side.
But to say that at the outset,
yes,
surely...
This is not a rebellion. It's a civil war. And there is a difference. But Syria is a very deeply divided society. The opposition clearly has a popular base. I don't think it represents more than half of Syrian society at this point. But the Assad government also has a popular base, which is probably around half of Syrian society. This is a civil war, and the only way in which you can resolve this is with a serious mediation effort. But you will not get that by requiring at the outset that the leader of one side step down.
Carne Ross, what is the UN's role then when it's caught in what becomes this sort of proxy battle of international powers?
Well, it's whatever the great powers decide it to be. There isn't necessarily a particular role. I think the cult of mediation is somewhat overstated at the UN, and the reflex action of sending mediators to every conflict is not always the correct one. The UN is a place where countries discuss what to do about, the Security Council in particular is a place where countries discuss what to do about threats to international peace and security like this, and hopefully they can come to some consensus about what to do about it. It's not always simply to send a mediator, and frankly, in my view, it may have been a mistake to send a mediator in this circumstance, because I think it gave the Assad regime a kind of excuse to keep going and not to step down and not to resist not to succumb to international pressure. It also gave Russia an excuse to resist further measures against the regime.
Arguably, they'd also
could say, there's mediation going on. We must step back until that has clearly failed. And I think that now points to what needs to be done now. There needs to be enormous and blunt pressure on Russia to get Assad to the table, to get him to talk seriously about stepping down and allowing the circumstances for a transition.
But arguably a failed peace mission, and a peace mission that is undertaken while various members of the UN are actively arming the rebels, gives a pretext for intervention as well, though, doesn't it? I mean, isn't it?
Well, I don't think anybody wants to intervene, and I think that's
or further arming of the rebels, or further. Or further support for the rebels?
Well, none of the P5 are arming the rebels. The Russians are arming the regime, that's for certain, but none of the P5 are arming the rebels, and I don't think there's any intention to do so. And there's no sort of agenda here of going in for a humanitarian intervention, quote unquote, military intervention. There's no indication that anybody in Washington or the West wants to do that.
No, I think they want to do it. I mean, they certainly don't want to go in, but we do have now this President Obama intelligence finding, Flynt Leverett. What does that actually mean? That he's now given agencies within the government approval to help, well, not now actually, a few months ago apparently he signed this, that they're allowed to help the rebels overthrow Assad, which again makes you wonder about how genuine they were about Kofi Annan's peace mission. But what does that actually mean?
It means that the CIA is now working in camps in Turkey, perhaps elsewhere. It is working with Turkey, it's working with Qatar, it's working with Saudi Arabia, countries that are providing lethal assistance and weapons to the opposition. They are helping to coordinate those activities, to vet groups that would receive this kind of lethal assistance.
So the P5 isn't actually arming the rebels, but
it's helping other countries with resources to do it for them. And I think you're right, it really does raise questions about the motives of American policy here. I think the real driver for the Obama administration is they want to pursue regime change in Syria as a way of getting at Iran. I think there's a critical mass of people in the administration who believe that if you could bring down the Assad regime, you would do severe damage to Iran's regional position and maybe even reignite the Green movement inside the Islamic Republic. I think those are both fantasies.
The entire region, to having utter conflagration in the Middle East.
Yes, and so they start down this road and then they realize that there are these potential complications, and so they hedge, they pull back a bit, and the results are not always very coherent, shall we say. But I think the real root motive of American policy here is an effort to weaken and undermine Iran, and that's why the United States fundamentally didn't want Annan's effort to succeed.
But as we look at those whom the US is facilitating in this effort, Michele, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, is it clear that they actually have a plan of what to do if Assad does fall? Is there coherence there? Is it simply about Iran? Do we know what they're up to?
No, and I have to say, I really think we're discussing this whole thing as though there are, chess pieces on the board that the United States and other powers are moving around. And I don't think that's what's going on at all. I think that what has happened is that the Syrian rebellion has escalated, and it is true the rebels have succeeded in obtaining from the countries that Flynt named a different sort of weapons. And this whole thing has taken off militarily in a different way in about the last 5-6 weeks or so, okay? So, I mean, the one thing that or one of the things that I disagree with that Kofi Annan said in his Financial Times piece is that this is a stalemate. I don't think it's a stalemate, or it is no longer a stalemate on the ground in Syria. The rebels are gaining ground rapidly against the Syrian regime. They may or may not win. But look, I mean, if you just...
We have journalists on the ground, and it's very difficult to make these pronouncements.
Okay, was there fighting in Damascus, and was the Syrian regime struggling to hold on to Damascus and Aleppo 6 months ago? No, this thing has turned a corner, and it has changed, and there is a real possibility that the rebels will bring down the Syrian government. Now, you get back to what happens then, and I agree, that's a very messy picture, and that has been one of the things that has held the United States and others back. I disagree with Flynt, by the way, that the United States' main interest here is depriving Iran of an ally. That might be a benefit, strategically, so to speak, if the al-Assad regime falls. But I really do think we have to remember this is a rebellion that Syrians started. Right. We did not go in there and instigate this fight.
So, Carne Ross, is that simply what happened? This was a peaceful rebellion against Bashar al-Assad, and then the Saudis and the Qataris heard this cry for self-determination and freedom and democracy and simply were moved to act and benignly help these rebels achieve that end.
Well, I think two things, which in a sense are slightly contradictory. One, I think that outside players and indeed diplomacy has been largely irrelevant in this story, and it arguably is becoming less and less relevant by the day. This is going to have to be sorted out by Syrians, and unfortunately it looks like they're going to sort it out militarily, which is disastrous and awful, and we ought to encourage the rebels on the one side and of course the regime on the other to think very, very hard about what they're getting into, and particularly where we have influence with the rebels, we should be saying to them they need to lay out transition plans. They need to make abundantly clear that in their future dispensation, minorities and particularly the Alawites will be protected. But yes, there are other agendas at play here. There's no doubt. For the Qataris and for the Saudis, this is part of a broader battle across the Middle East to limit and to push back Iranian influence. One could also interpret it somewhat as a Sunni Shia thing. Unfortunately, that's not good. But that is not the instigating power in this. This started, as Michele said, but was started by the Syrians themselves.
I would point out, it's not true that the United States has not been helping Syrian oppositionists before March 2011. We know from WikiLeaks cables that the United States under the Bush administration was providing assistance to Syrian oppositionists for years before March 2011.
Yeah, I mean, that has always been, the Syrian question has always been there. I mean, I was just looking at a FT article from 2005 talking about Stephen Hadley, George W. Bush's national security advisor, probably someone you worked with, talking about trying to find an alternative to Assad. And it doesn't seem they've done, they didn't do terribly well, I guess, in finding. I mean, that's the big decision. We have been hearing voices within the Beltway suggest they have found someone. General Manaf Tlass, the Wall Street Journal, saying that the US is actively discussing how to place him at the center of the political transition. He's a Sunni, we're told. He likes red wine and Cuban cigars, so clearly he's not a fundamentalist. And he might be Syria's Ahmed Chalabi. I mean, actually, we can just see it. He gave a press conference quite recently. Let's just have a little bit of that.
Dear.
Let's have a little.
It is our obligation today as Syrians to unite for one purpose, and that is to bring about freedom and democracy to our country without destroying it, so that we can begin again. Syria is greater than its individuals and its current history. Our revolution must be won against corruption and oppression, but without the destruction of our social fabric.
And I know Michele objects to this idea of looking at it from the chessboard perspective, but it does seem, though, that those some in the Beltway who at least, who are now convinced, okay, it's time to get rid of Assad, are coalescing around this man. Who is he, Flynt? Will he do U.S. bidding? Does he have terribly good democratic credentials? He's part of the old crony oligarchy of Syria, after all.
His father was Hafez al-Assad's long-serving defense minister. Manaf Talas had achieved general-level rank in the Syrian army and was apparently at least somewhat personally close to Bashar al-Assad. The comparison to Chalabi is apt in that I don't think Talas is going to have any more effective a role in Syria's political future than Ahmed Chalabi has had.
Are you hearing whispers about him, though? Is he seriously being thought of as someone to be
People in Washington are looking around for someone that they could maybe hang their hats on, try and get other opposition elements to coalesce around, and who might make at least some of the right noises that we would want to hear out of such a figure. But I don't think he has that much standing among the oppositionists at this point. And for the people on the other side, that roughly half of Syrian society that I think is still invested in some way in the Assad government, I think at this point Talas would be, a highly polarizing and unacceptable figure.
But on this issue of motivations, then, Carne Ross mentioned Russia, and we have to come back to that, actually. There is that other theory, though, is that in arming the opposition, it isn't necessarily to achieve horrible hegemonic ends. This is about reaching a conflict resolution. It's the only way to show Russia that there does need to be Russia clearly has a great deal invested in Assad. Unless the opposition is a force to be reckoned with, they're not going to be terribly serious about conflict resolution either. But they don't mean what they say when they talk about, yes, we'll have a managed transition.
I think there's a better way, which is actually to test the proposition that Russia, China, Iran, others would actually be supportive of a serious political process aimed at resolving this conflict. I don't think Russian, Chinese, or Iranian interests are particularly well served by having a civil war in Syria that goes on for years and years, like one did in Lebanon next door. I think that there would be serious interest in Russia, in Iran, in China, in a serious political process that really did aim at a broad-based power-sharing arrangement that would create a stable situation that could not be exploited by other powers.
That point, though,
Flynt, you
Carne
have to
Ross.
accept that the Russians have done remarkably little to foster such a process so far.
Well,
They've been taking pot shots at the West. Most of their strategy seems to be driven by a desire to block whatever the West wants to do. It's partly payback for the overreach, as Russia sees it, of NATO in Libya, but it's also part of a broader and clear geopolitical kind of paranoia on Putin and Lavrov's part that they're being ignored in international affairs. This is somewhere they can show that they're important. And I'm afraid that's got nothing to do with Syria. It's got nothing to do with the welfare of the Syrian people. It's a pretty disgraceful way of behaving.
But isn't the problem, though, with that the only thing, in this murky Syrian conflict, when we're not really sure what we're even talking about when we talk about the opposition, the only thing that's achieved at this point by international covert intervention is continuing that principle of a certain group of powers, the US, Saudi, Qatar, being able to go anywhere they want to overthrow regimes, no matter what the consequences are for the region.
Well, I don't think anybody should be allowed to go and overthrow regimes, regardless. I think absolutely if there's any consensus amongst your panelists this afternoon, it is that there should be a political process to try to manage a transition. And I think Western diplomacy, our influence with the rebels, and indeed what we should be saying in Moscow are the same thing, that the rebels need to be united, need to be making clear that they want a democratic transition where everybody's interests will be taken account of.
But I have to go back to Kofi Annan.
But they're not united on that. They don't all all accept that proposition.
And Kofi Annan does seem to be suggesting that there was never much belief in a managed transition. There was never that interest in a peace process. That's what Kofi Annan seems to be suggesting in his FT report. Michele Dunne, last word. We're running out of time. Michele, last word.
Look, that's not the nature of this thing, right? I mean, I think if Bashar al-Assad had been willing to step aside and let others, because there was absolutely no faith on the part of the rebels at all that Bashar would lead a managed transition. Who could believe that? If Bashar had been willing to step aside, if the Russians had worked seriously with others within the regime to bring about a transition that anybody could believe in, then there might have been such a chance, and maybe there still can be, at the 11th hour now. But that hasn't started.
Why is Russia supposed to surrender that?
All right, we're leaving it there. Flynt Leverett, thank you very much. Michele Dunne, thank you. Carne Ross, thank you very much to you. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.